All right. I'm the junior Smith on the Ninth Circuit, and I'm here today at our circuit conference on July 13th of 2015 in San Diego, California, and I'm here with the opportunity to introduce the senior Smith on our circuit as a part of the Historical Society's effort to interview judges and get to know a little bit about the history of each one of them. And I'm especially honored to interview my big brother and have this opportunity. We're often called the Smith brothers, though we really aren't. So, Honorable Smith, I'm going to deviate from what's said just a little bit. Tell us a little bit about where you were born, when, what were the circumstances, and tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll get into other questions.
Okay. I was born May 19th, 1942 in Pendleton, Oregon. My parents had moved there after, well, they had both served in the Mormon Church mission. My dad originally in England and then later on in New York because the war started. Met my mother there. They got married sometime after that, moved to Pendleton, Oregon, where my grandfather had wanted to start a food processing plant. So I was the first of what ultimately turned out to be 8 blood siblings and 2 adopted, if you will, siblings. Our family was involved in contracting with farmers to grow mainly peas. Later that went into corn, peas, lima beans, pearl onions, corn on the cob, that sort of thing. And it went from canned to frozen.
So, Honorable, you told us a little bit about your parents and how many children they had, but you want to tell us anything about these children? I know there are at least one that's infamous or famous, and you may tell us about these siblings that you have, because I think that's pretty neat about you.
I'm the oldest of the 10. I have, the next is a sister, Melanie. By the way, as a group, we had a lot of kids. When my mother died at 85, she had 29 grandchildren and 53 great-grandchildren, which is unusual today. Melanie had, among other things, triplet boys, which makes it a little bit unusual. My sister Charlotte had a number of children as well. Melanie lives in Arizona today, Charlotte does as well. My brother Greg had a number of children. He is also in Arizona. He teaches. My sisters worked sometime, but mainly not out of the home. My brother Mike lives in Washington State, now works for my brother. He drives a truck, the big semi-trucks. My brother Mike is a dentist in Arizona, has a lot of kids. My brother Gordon is the one I think you're referring to. He ultimately acquired the family businesses, went into politics in the state of Oregon as a state senator, then became a United States senator for 2 terms, which of course was instrumental in my opportunity. He is now the head of the National Association of Broadcasters, which represents radio and television interests in the United States, and is involved in a lot of governmental type activities. I have a sister, Lisa, who passed away when she was 52. She was running, came home, had a bad headache. Turned out she had a cerebral embolism, so we lost her early. I have a sister, Jessica, who is an attorney, lives in North Carolina, has 3 kids. Her husband's also in law. So that's the group.
Very distinguished family, and you being the oldest, very distinguished. So tell us about your childhood, where you went to school, what you like to study, what kind of things made you the way you are, and then I'll talk to you about being a lawyer.
Okay. Well, I felt very fortunate. Although my father was in food processing, but for World War II, said he wanted to go to law school. And as you know, I'm sure, in that era, you did not have to have a bachelor's degree to go to law school. And he told me he was accepted at Northwestern Law School, but with the draft being what it was, if he stayed in the family business where they were dealing with an essential industry, he was deferred. whereas if he'd gone to law school, he would have immediately been drafted. So he didn't do that, but he was interested in the law. He ultimately went to Washington, became the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Department of Agriculture for a time, then stayed in Washington to run a trade association and so on. And that gave me the split between Washington, a little cowboy town. We'd have a rodeo there every year, and Washington, D.C. My mother was from the Udall and Lee families in Arizona. They were always very involved in politics and law and government. That's the same line from which Morris and Stuart Udall come, and Rex Lee and so on. And so it's a rich family tradition that actually goes back for 4 generations. There's actually a pedigree chart in Wikipedia that shows all the lawyers and the politicians and the judges from back the years. So it kind of runs in the blood, if you know what I mean.
Well, that's what I wanted you to emphasize, and I'm glad you did, because really Mo Udall's from your family, Stuart from your family, and then of course your brother, and then you got the big brother right here.
Well, I was very fortunate, I think, Randy, in having this, if you will, bifurcated childhood. In Oregon, you know, we were just a bunch of little hick kids running around playing with, you know, snowmobiles. No, I didn't have those then, but you know, just rolling down the hill with all kinds of American flyers or whatever they called them. We went into we were near the airport. We used to go look at all the planes and get wings from the stewardesses when they'd come in. And my dad was a very prominent figure in the church in that area, in the Mormon church, and he was a bishop at like 22 and a stake president when he was like 30. So I got an exposure to that kind of thing. When we moved to Washington, he was at the USDA, but he also joined the National Press Club as a non-correspondent. And I was always fascinated with history and books. Because of my grandfather, Udall, I think I kind of knew from the time I was like 7 or 8 that I wanted to be a lawyer. And excuse me, I would go with my dad, and they'd let me sit up in front when these speakers would come in, because I was a teenager, and they thought that was good. And I met Richard Nixon and John Kennedy and George Wallace before he got shot. I even saw Nikita Khrushchev out at the Beltsville Agricultural Farm holding a goose or something like that. Met the Dulles brothers, met Estes Kefauver, met Bobby Kennedy, Jack Kennedy. You know, and as a young person, you have this experience of meeting these people. And in our ward, we had somebody that was the head of the FCC. We had my home teaching companion was a guy named Orville Pusey, who worked for the Washington Post, who wrote the definitive biography on Charles Evans Hughes. And these are really interesting people. And I was interested in them and what they did. So I think I kind of was imbued with, if you will, the family sense of public service, of interest. And I always loved that. I thought it was really an enjoyable, if you will, starting time, a time for learning things and putting things in perspective.
Any role models you had at that period which you tried to fashion yourself after, but other than what you've talked to us about?
I think my main role model was my grandfather, Jesse Udall. He was came from a very poor. He was in the second family of David King Udall, who was the Mormon stake president in St. John's, and his wife, Ida Hunt Udall, was a second plural wife in those days, the Mormon period. And they were out in the desert. They were quite literally out in the desert, had marshals chasing them around. And from that family, you have 6 judges and 1 mayor of Phoenix. Every one of them got involved. And he worked up in doing all kinds of things. He actually drove some of the last of the Pony Express periods when they still did that. It didn't do it much, but for a short period of time he did that. He became a local politician. He became a county judge. Because he'd been in World War I as an ambulance driver, he had been very active with the National Guard. And when World War II came along, he just didn't think, even though at that point he had, I think, 6 children, he didn't feel he could send these boys off to war and not be doing something. So he enlisted. He was in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, as I think as a colonel or something. He would go around and judge espionage cases, you know, in factories. But he was. Just give you an example. At his funeral, one of his Supreme Court justices said something about him that I think explains how I felt about him. He said, "I'm sorry to say that there have been many men that I have envied for what they had, but only one man for who he was, and that was Jesse A. Udall." He was a wonderful human being. He was kind, he was thoughtful, he was intelligent, but he liked people. He reached out to people. And I thought that was wonderful. I thought that was a great thing. And he was, to the degree I had a role model, it was Jesse Udall.
Well, I'm very happy you told that story, because you've told me before. I think that's you. So I thought that was very nice.
Thank you.
So you had all this idea to go to college or to be a lawyer. So what did you do? How did you get about that? Anything we ought to know about that?
Well, I regret to say that I wasn't more studious in high school. I played more basketball than I did studies, but as was very much the tradition at that time in active Mormon families, I decided I was, in at least that part of the country, I decided I would go to BYU. And frankly, I didn't even apply anywhere else. And that was at the time when, to get into BYU, if you were breathing and you had any kind of an academic diploma, you could get in. That's no longer the case. But I got there, and I had a great freshman year. That was great fun. I probably had a B average. I really didn't study very hard. But then I went on a Mormon mission to Argentina for 2.5 years, and that changed my world. About a month and a half after I got there, I was assigned to go out to marry a young couple out near Pergamino, and didn't speak much Spanish because I just started to learn it. I went out there and found out that the groom had not passed the Wasserman test, so I had to console this family. Here I was, a 19-year-old, didn't know anything. I learned a lot about life in a hurry and about other people and other people's problems. And so, as I think we all know, when we're teenagers, particularly in a late period, you think the world revolves around you and you know everything. I learned very quickly that that was not the case, and had a good experience. So I enjoyed it very much. I had the experience as a teenager to be reading. There was a woman named Evelyn Wood who was a speed reading instructor, and she was in our ward. She taught me how to speed read, and I was very good at it. And she hired me as a demonstrator to go with her, and we'd go to libraries up and down the East Coast, and the librarian would give us a new book that had just come out, nobody could have read, and so usually it was me and a female counterpart. We would read the book, and then the librarian would ask us questions. Well, I did that in the mission field. I would say to a lot of business people, look, if you'll read these Mormon tracts, I'll teach you how to speed read. And we did that. We had a little television show. It was a really interesting time. I was down there in Montevideo when Jack Kennedy was killed. People were coming up telling us how sorry they were. I was down there during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I remember worrying about my folks that were in the Washington area. I was in this different part of the world, but it was a scary, scary time. Anyway, so I did that. I came back, went to BYU, but a very changed person. I never had anything but A's after that. I won the, I guess what's called the National Honor Scholarship at the University of Chicago. I was accepted at the same time on the waiting list for Yale. But when I got the scholarship for Chicago, that sealed the deal. I was lucky to get in, frankly. And as Tom Griffith and I joke about, neither one of us could get an interview with ourselves today. In any event, I went to Chicago, had a wonderful experience there. I really enjoyed it. And then, maybe I'm jumping ahead, I don't know. But,
no, go right on. Yeah, I was taking you to college and then your job.
Yeah, and then I married in my at the end of my junior year of college. And by the time I got out of law school, I had 2 children. The Vietnam War was on, and so there was no possibility of my clerking anywhere if I wanted to avoid the draft, which I did. But with these kids, I was still okay. There was no issue there. But I had clerked for Covington and Burling And I'll tell you more about that in a minute because it's an important thing in terms of my getting this job. I clerked the summer of 1968 when the world was coming apart. We had Resurrection City with all the tents and so on along the mall. Supreme Court found in Furman, I think it was, that the death penalty was unconstitutional that year. Everything was falling apart. And in Chicago, while I was in Washington, they had the Chicago riots and all that sort of thing. So I came back. My then spouse was from Santa Barbara, and she said, why don't we go out to my folks' place for Thanksgiving? I said, well, that's fine, but in other words, interviewing some firms in California. I said, well, that's fine, but I don't think it's honest to just interview them and not look at them. So she said, oh, fine. So I interviewed with what was then Pillsbury, Madison, and Sutro, as then constituted in San Francisco, and then OMelveny and Myers in Los Angeles. Interesting thing happened, the way, kind of a twist of fate. I had been offered a job at Covington and Burling to come back, but I needed to let them know by December the 3rd of 1968 whether I was going to accept. And of course, no fax, no emails, nothing. We had phones, but everything was by mail. And I went to OMelveny just after Thanksgiving, had 2 days of interviews, and what changed my life was they offered me a job on the spot. Had they sent me an offer in the mail, I would have already said yes to Covington and Burling, would have ended up in Washington, D.C. Well, I was really impressed with OMelveny. I thought, I love California. It's a great place. This is a meritocracy. This is a neat place. I really, really like it. And I figured I can always go back to Washington. So as it turned out, I decided to go to OMelveny and Myers, and my then spouse was very unhappy with that. She wanted to stay in the East, but it worked out really well for me. I don't know how fast you want me to go through this.
Keep
but
going. You're going exactly where I wanted to go.
Okay. So anyway, I stayed at OMelveny for exactly 3 years. I had the good fortune of being a very good business getter. I was actually bringing in some major pieces of business that OMelveny and Myers wanted. And after I'd been there 3 years and had some really good training, I thought, well, why don't I do this for myself? So I set up my own firm and was shortly thereafter joined by a guy I knew from Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, a guy named Keith Hilbig. And we formed what was, of course, at that point called Smith & Hilbig. The firm never got bigger than 15. We never intended to get very big. It was a small boutique firm, but we had some wonderful clients. And I actually tripled my income the first year I left OMelveny and Myers, so that wasn't bad from my perspective.
So what types of cases did you do?
Because I left OMelveny, I got to do litigation in addition to transactions work, which was my primary focus. And during that time, I had, during the trials that I had 10 trials from beginning to end, which is nothing compared to what you did. But as a transactions lawyer, it wasn't bad. So I had 10 trials, including 2 jury trials. And interestingly enough, I won them all. So I was happy with those.
So you should have been a trial lawyer.
but I enjoyed it. But I loved transactions. I loved to draft. I loved to write the contracts and negotiate with the parties and put it in writing, help it get implemented. Because I felt that it was constructive. I felt that litigation was pathology, basically, and that in the transactions area, there was an airport, or there was a hotel, or there was a shopping center, or there was a development of something, and that was important to me. I thought that was really good.
So you did this in your own law firm, and you stayed
Correct.
with that law firm. Did you get involved in politics at all, or any other things that were community-minded?
I did a lot of that. Most of it was small level. I started little things like something called the Informed Voters League, where we'd have local speakers come in and talk, and congressmen and women and others. But my main community involvement there, in addition to church, which was a big thing in those days, I was appointed by then Governor Duke Majan to head something called the Los Angeles State Building Authority, which is it's a joint exercise of powers between the state of California and the city of Los Angeles. And I was the president of that authority when we built the so-called Ronald Reagan building, which was a design-build, beautiful building. It's won lots of awards. But I was also appointed by him to something called the Fair Employment and Housing Commission, which played a big role, I think, in my getting on this court.
That's why I wanted you to go there.
That was a point. It was basically the State Civil Rights Commission. We heard appeals, administrative law appeals. In those days, they were mainly sexual harassment cases under the State UNRRA Civil Rights Act and the Bain Civil Rights Act, but mainly UNRRA. So these were primarily women who wanted to get compensatory damages, punitive damages. My appointment to this authority was nomination by the governor, confirmation by the state senate for a 4-year term. I want to go back just for a second to tell.
This is your interview, so you get it the way you want to. Go ahead.
In 1968, when I was at Covington and Burling, a man named Dean Acheson was the senior partner there. He was, of course, the former Secretary of State under Harry Truman, played a huge role, wrote a book called President the Creation, which is a fascinating study of foreign policy during and after World War II. They rolled him out to talk to the summer associates. And one of the things that he said to us was, gentlemen, it was all men at that point, gentlemen, I have a lesson I want to teach you. In 1935, if I recall the date correctly, I was Undersecretary of the Treasury under Franklin Roosevelt, and he took us off the gold standard. I thought it was so wrong as a matter of law, so wrong as a matter of policy, that I could no longer stay there. And I tendered my resignation. And my advice to you is, as gentlemen, if you ever are involved in a political office or appointed by a political person, and you cannot morally sustain the policy of the government, the only honorable thing for a gentleman to do is to resign. So I remembered that. And we move forward now to the Fair Employment and Housing Commission. The California Supreme Court struck down in 2 cases, Dynamed and I forget the other one, the ability of our commission to award compensatory or punitive damages on the basis that it was a separation of powers. We were part of the executive branch. We had no authority to do that. So we were essentially out of business. And I said to my co-commissioners, look, I think I have an answer to this. I'll write some legislation that will allow a defendant to opt out of the administrative system, go to court if they want to. That way they have the full separation of powers, they have all the due process they want. I think that will work. And they thought, great. So I went to then State Senator Marion Bergeson, who I knew, who'd been a running mate of one of the former Republican candidates for governor, and got her to carry a bill that I helped draft. In the meantime, I went to work with the California Association of Manufacturers, California Chamber of Commerce, and others to explain to them how much better it was for business to resolve genuine disputes in this setting rather than going to court where perhaps millions of dollars would be involved. Got their support. About that time, the governor changed. Pete Wilson became the governor. And the bill passed both houses of the legislature. We had a guy named, I think it was Frank Zarenberg, who was the governor as a liaison, if you will. We thought we were all set. And then on the eve of the Clarence Thomas vote in Washington, he vetoed the bill. Wilson did. Well, all of a sudden I started thinking about Dean Acheson. I have a year to go on my term, but I thought this commission's out of business and this is a fraud. We can't do anything to help these women, and they've been, the ones who get an award have genuinely proven their case. They're entitled to this. This is just wrong. So despite strong advice from friends who thought I was insane, that I would destroy any possibility of doing anything in the future in the political area, I resigned. I took Pete Wilson's veto letter, went through it as a lawyer, and then I finished by saying, in essence, you know, I've been a conservative all my life, but this is wrong. You know, these women have been injured. They're entitled to recompense under the law. This is wrong policy. It's wrong morally, and I resign. I won't be part of it. It was a little flap, you know, but then it just went away. I'm sure my friends thought I was nuts. But then, moving forward, years later, I really was focused on raising 6 kids and running my law practice. And then my brother became a U.S. Senator. And I had always thought this would be a wonderful opportunity, but little did I know, of course, then was a Democratic president, and that was not going to happen. But when Bush came along, I thought, oh boy, this is going to be great, because Orrin Hatch had been a friend for years. He said, this is great, no problem. So we went with, when Bush got in, I went with my brother and my wife, who's a Democrat, and we went to Barbara Boxer's office. I'd never met Barbara Boxer, but she had just blue-slipped Christopher Cox, a former, I guess at that point he still was a congressman from Orange County, later SEC chair. Carolyn Kuehl, who was a former person in the SG's office who'd argued the Bob Jones case before the Supreme Court. William, whatever his name was, from Wyoming, who they tried to get in the Ninth Circuit.
Meyer.
Meyer, that's right. I mean, she was having Republican nominees for lunch, basically, but not to share food with them. But she was, she was killing the nomination. So we went to her office, and with Gordon, never met her before. She came in. She's quite diminutive in size, but not in personality. I never met her before, and I was going to try to explain to her why I thought I'd be a good Ninth Circuit judge. We sat down on her couch, and she said, "May I call you Milan?" Sure, great. She said, "Call me Barbara." And I was about to explain why I thought I'd be a good judge, and guess what she took out? A copy of my resignation letter that I had sent to Pete Wilson 20 years before. And she said, and I'm kind of shorthanding it, I wish you were a liberal Democrat, but I'm not going to get that from George Bush. But what you did here showed character, integrity, fidelity to the law, all the things that I want in a judge. Whatever you need me to do, either being for you or against you, I will do so. You can imagine, this is one of those very few times when a good deed actually does bear fruit. I never dreamed in my wildest imagination when I resigned that anything like that would happen. But I'm convinced to this day, since Barbara Boxer, as I'll explain later, actually read from this letter on her speech on the floor of the U.S. Senate the day I was confirmed. This was a powerful impact on her. I like to think that my grandfather, Udall, would have been pleased.
I think he would have been pleased. Anything else you want to say about that confirmation process? I've heard that story before, so I wanted you to get to that story, and you got there. But anything else about the process that you found exhilarating, or something that you'd like to put in a history?
My experience was different than that of a lot of folks, in that the Senate wasn't my problem. It was the White House. I was very naive, frankly. And so was my brother Gordon. He was relatively new in the process because, although he dealt with Clinton on some of his nominees, he was new with the Republican process. We had Alberto Gonzales there, who, whatever else he was not very good at this. And so when I went back, I had this naive impression that because Orrin Hatch was a good friend and my brother was a U.S. Senator, I was going to get nominated any time. Well, nothing could have been further from the truth. They already had a slate of people that they wanted, and then after that they wanted to go to Hispanics. My name was approved by the committee, if you will, the lawyers. They liked me, but I wasn't Hispanic and I wasn't way to the right in terms of legal philosophy. So during that first term, I kept thinking I'd be talking to Gordy all the time. I kept thinking I was going to get nominated. But all these things were happening, and there weren't that many seats opening up. And I now know after the fact that, for example, the seat that I got was offered to Deborah Wong Yang, who was the former U.S. attorney in Los Angeles. But because she had gone through a bitter divorce, needed to support her 3 daughters, she turned it down. Had she not done so, I would not have had this opportunity. But then when Bush was elected second time, then the Senate composition had changed, and all of a sudden moderates were in greater favor. And at that point, we had to wait for the ABA review after the nomination was sent in. So after the White House cleared me and the FBI and so on, they sent the nomination to the Senate Judiciary Committee on, of all things, Valentine's Day, 2006. And I'd filled out all the forms and so on. And by the time, then we did the ABA deal. And I was delighted that they gave me a well-qualified rating, which of course made it much easier for anybody that had any issues to vote. And then we had the hearing, and there were a lot of people waiting, as you know, because you were sort of in the queue at that point. And I'm told by Orrin Hatch that what happened was, my brother was putting pressure on them, but Orrin Hatch told me that he had gotten a call by then Harriet Myers, who had taken over as the, I guess it was the counsel of the president.
Counsel of the President in charge of judicial
Right, exactly.
nominees.
And she just said, what can we do to move some of these nominees? And he said, till you move Milan Smith, we're not moving anybody. So all of a sudden, I was moved up to the head of the line. I had the ABA news 6 weeks after I was nominated. I had a hearing 6 weeks after I was nominated. It was a love fest. I went there with Kate and some of my family members were able to come, some friends. They had 4 judges, district judges from New Jersey. Senator Boxer came, gave us glowing, wonderful talk referring to the resignation letter. Senator Feinstein, who probably didn't even know my name very well by then, but she called me Milan or something like that, but she was supportive. Then my brother gave a talk, and Hatch gave a talk, and he basically asked me whether I like puppies. It was that kind of thing. It was not hard. And so it was all looking good. And then we met with Senator Kennedy, and who was just great. I said, I don't want to get tied up with anybody's controversy. Said, don't worry about it. We're going to take care of it. So the glorious day came, May 16th, 2006, and it was quite an experience, as you know. I happened to have been, because I didn't know when this was going to happen, I happened to be with some friends golfing, of all things, in South Carolina. But I got a call from my brother. They were going to have the confirmation. So I was there with these friends, watching C-SPAN. And it says, vote upon the confirmation, Milan D. Smith Jr., and there was Barbara Boxer. God bless her. She, in her speech, she referred quite extensively to this resignation letter to Wilson. And she stands up there with Ted Kennedy at the well of the Senate checking off all the Democrats. And there's my brother and Orrin Hatch checking off all the Republicans. And when it was all done, it was 93-0. There were 7 people that were out campaigning or whatever. But as you know, that kind of an experience, I mean, there are 179 circuit judgeships in the country, active judgeships. To have the privilege of doing that, one of those rare moments, it's like being struck by lightning. But I had a good cry. And as you can tell, I have that lachrymose quality when there's something touching. It was a magical moment. And I was so glad. I called my wife, who was with some neighbors at home, and they were cheering. But it was a great experience. It really was. And so that's how I got to court.
Well, I don't know how much time I got, but there are 2 questions you really need to answer. Okay. One is you've referred to Kate. Mm-hmm. And I think you need to tell us a little bit about Kate.
Okay.
Because I think that's you.
Mm-hmm.
As I've known you, if she weren't with you, you wouldn't be who you are. So I think you need to tell us about her. And then I think you need to tell us, you've been on the court since 2006, mm-hmm. a little bit how you like it, what do you think about it, where do you think you're going, what's going to be any cases that stand out or whatever. But first,
okay.
Kate.
Okay, well, that's most appropriate. I agree with you. Kate is the greatest joy of my life. I was so fortunate I was married for 29 years, and my wife and I, at that point, she wanted somebody different. She wanted something different in life, and so she ultimately filed. But before that, long before that had happened, Kate and her former husband had been moving across the country. He was in the Air Force. She ultimately ended up in California and took her 5th bar exam. She's belonged to a lot of those. But she'd gotten a tax law degree at George Washington. And our firm happened to be looking, we had no females at that point, and we needed to have a female, but we really needed somebody with a strong tax background. So here came this resume in the mail. You know, the fact that she had the tax law degree was really an important thing. I didn't know her, knew very little about her, but we invited her to come to lunch with me and my other partners, and she had a wonderful laugh, wonderful demeanor, but yeah, I mean, I had no concept of anything other than this is somebody we're considering as an associate. We made her an offer, I think, the next day to join the firm. She did shortly thereafter. When she was being considered for partner, she came in and said, I just want you to know I'm getting a divorce. I hope that doesn't make any difference. Of course, it didn't. She's a wonderful lawyer. So she let us know that. And about 3 years later, my spouse told me that she was going on. And so after that happened, Kate and I were working as colleagues, as partners. And I, as a business getter, I needed to be out there doing things, and so I asked her if she would join me in doing some business origination. And I started to look at her very differently. She was not just a wonderful, indeed.
Better than a lawyer.
Indeed, not just a wonderful lawyer, a wonderful way with people, but she was a fabulous human being. And it was like being a teenager. I mean, it's like a stick of dynamite in a factory. It was so wonderful, such a fabulous, romantic, exciting courtship. And we dated for 3 years, got married in 1996, and have just celebrated our 19th anniversary. She has a daughter who I consider my own daughter as well, and we've just been so fortunate. But as you point out, she is... had I been married to the other person, I would have never had this opportunity because of the money. She would have never gone along with making less money. She wanted more money. But Kate was 100% supportive and has continued to be that. And she's the greatest blessing in my life.
Well, she's an apple of a lot of our eyes and such a wonderful lady. Now, I'm about to run out of time maybe, but I want you to tell me a little bit about the court since 2006.
Okay.
What you've enjoyed, what you haven't enjoyed, what cases stand out to you. If you don't say all the right cases, I'll prompt you. Go ahead.
All right. Well, I've enjoyed the court immensely. I'm just starting my 10th year, as you pointed out. I love this job. I love this job. I'm 73 years old now. I feel like a kid, and not in this side of my body, but my mind. I'm just enjoying it immensely. I enjoy the collegiality. I enjoy the repartee. I enjoy the thinking, the ability to reason back and forth with each other, and yet maintaining friendships and relationships. When I came on the court, I think one of the first things that got my attention was the fact that I felt that in the environmental area that we had a few colleagues, wonderful people, but we're just making it up. You know, they would do anything to stop whatever that was not in the regulations or in the underlying statute. And so I had an opportunity starting fairly early in a case called Lands Council versus McNair, which of course is seated in Idaho. I had Judge Ferguson and Judge Reinhardt, and there was basically a forest project that had been approved, and they had cited something that Betty Fletcher had written that basically added key components that were in none of the regulations, none of the statutes, that suggested that you had to literally trod all the ground and check everything before you could make some determination. So I wrote a dissent that basically pointed out that this was not in the law, it was not in the regulations, and I pointed out the harm that it did to real people in the real world, and they were shocked. You know, you could talk about it in a criminal defense area, but the idea that you would say what was happening when you don't follow the law in the environmental area is just shocking. But interestingly enough, the department, actually it was the U.S. Forest Service, appealed. And it was taken en banc. And I had the opportunity to write what I'm told was the first unanimous environmental en banc case in, at that point, over 30 years, called Lands Council versus McNair, which recognized the role, the important role of specialized agencies that we need. We're not scientists, we need to defer to them. Obviously we need to follow the statute, we need to follow the regulations, but we don't just make this stuff up. So that was an important first start. There are a lot of other cases, and I've ruled plenty of time for the environmental groups, but another one that stands out to me, I originally wrote in a majority opinion in a case called Karuk Tribe of California versus U.S. Forest Service, and that dealt with gold mining. But it really dealt with what constitutes an action under the Endangered Species Act. It went en banc, and I did not win. That position did not win. But I wrote a dissent, and I thought, I need to call the attention of the Supreme Court to what's going on here. So for the first and so far the only other time, I got a little plate from an early version of Gulliver's Travels, that long out of copyright, that showed him being tied down by the Lilliputans, or Putians, however you want to say it, and I put some quotes in there. So I went through this, pointing out legally what was going on, but I finished up with Dantes Inferno about, something of beware all who enter herein, kind of thing. And I cited 3 cases that, ironically, all of them were written by my good friend Willie Fletcher, that I thought were just completely out of whole cloth. I wrote down a couple of them, I've forgotten some of the names. And the first one is Northwest Earth Defense Council versus Brown, in which he found that all logging roads had to pass the Clean Water Act. And they were expressly exempted by the statute, and they were expressly exempted by the regulations. The second one was Pacific Rivers Council versus U.S. Forest Service, which knocked out a long-planned 11.5 million acre forest plan on the theory that this decision had to be made as reasonably, as quickly as possible. There was nothing in the regulation about that. And there was one other one. Make a long story short, despite some abuse from some commentators, which goes with the territory, the Supreme Court took the first case up, the logging case, even though the administration said, no, we're going to change the regulations. They said baloney, and they knocked it out. The second one, the Pacific Rivers, they decided, the Supreme Court said that the petitions would be based upon standing. The environmental groups said, no, don't do that. They said, please vacate the Ninth Circuit opinion, please vacate the District Court opinion. So 2 of the 3 cases that I cited as examples were gone within a year and a half. They're just off the books. I felt some satisfaction in that, in the sense that I see our role as being, we have to be faithful to the law. We may not like the result, but we have to be faithful to the law. And I feel, perhaps naively, that our court has been far more mainstream in our environmental jurisprudence in recent years, and I'd like to think that I played some role in bringing us back into conformity on that.
I agree. I agree with that. If you hadn't mentioned that, I would have brought it up. I think you have played a major role in that area.
There are 2 other ones I'll mention quickly. If we have, I don't know if we have time or not, but you tell me.
3 minutes.
Okay, I'll be quick. 2 other cases that stand out in my mind. They're not the world, but one of them is AlKidd versus Ashcroft.
I was going to get that.
That's one where we found that the former Attorney General of the United States had violated the Constitution in using the material witness statute to round up, in this case, Muslim men without charge and hold them indefinitely. Supreme Court reversed me on that, but that was a proud day. I just thought, how could we in this country, let people be rounded up without charge, destroy their families, destroy their jobs, solely for the purpose to get them off the streets? I thought it was just wrong. And I still think I was right legally, but that doesn't matter. But I'm proud of that case. Another one is interesting is the Alvarez case, the stolen valor case.
If you don't do the Alvarez case, you better. I'll just prompt you. And even though Junior, I'll overrule you.
Alvarez this is a case where a guy who was on a local water board, I don't mention that to Jay, but he lied about military service. He was a complete liar. But we had the case heard, and T.G. Nelson, your predecessor, and Jay Bybee were the other panel members. And the question was, does the Constitution cover the criminalization of lying where somebody gets no benefit? Now, the court had clearly set aside, defamation, perjury, fraud. All those are clearly exempted from the Constitution. But I could find no case law, starting from New York Times versus Sullivan, moving forward, that says because it's a lie that it's not covered. Jay strongly disagreed. Originally, when we voted in conference, Jay and TG were in the majority. I wrote a dissent. When TG wrote when he read my dissent, he said, "I've changed my mind." So he then, I became the author of the majority. Jay wrote a strong dissent. I wrote mine. It came very close to an en banc call that Dearman called, but it failed. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court took it, and I was in Alaska with Ted Goodwin and Willie Fletcher, and I got a call from Jay Bybee, and he said, "Are you gloating?" I said, "What about what?" He said, "Well, you haven't heard the news about Alvarez." He said, I was told by my friends at Latham and Watkins that you were going to lose 9-0. Well, guess what? You won 6-3. Now, I hated the case. I don't like lying, but the Constitution is the Constitution. And we also had this backwards, where you had a criminal defendant having to prove that he was entitled to constitutional right. Bottom line, this is a fascinating job. It's a wonderful job. And I feel extremely privileged to work with people and friends like you, to do our best to declare what the law is, to be faithful to that. And sometimes it's not easy, because you can want to follow natural predilections. But as you and I have dealt with some labor cases where I didn't like the result, but I dissented because I felt that's where the law was. So I feel very lucky, very, very fortunate, and I'm grateful to have a chance to tell a little bit of that story today.
Well, I don't know how far we are down there, but I am glad that you've talked about all the things you have, because I'm honored to be your colleague, Judge Smith. I only wish I were your little brother. You have a sterling reputation. You're a harmonizer. Yeah, I'm lucky to be a member of the court when you are, and I hope this wasn't too painful an interview. Thank you.
Thanks very much.